A hotel keycard, slipped between the pages of my husband's planner, third week of October, tucked behind a gas receipt from a town 60 miles from where he said he'd been. He'd been driving to Millbrook, he told me. A client meeting, back by 6. We had pot roast in the slow cooker. He came home at 8:30, kissed me on the cheek, said traffic was terrible on Route 9, and asked if there was anything left to eat. I put the keycard back exactly where I found it. I didn't say a word. My name is June, not June from the file, not anyone you'd recognize. I'm 63 years old. I've been married to my husband for 38 years. We live in a beige colonial in Harwich, Massachusetts, 15 minutes from the water, the same house we bought when our daughter was still in diapers. I taught elementary school for 31 years. I know how to read people. I know when something doesn't add up. And that keycard did not add up. The thing about being married to someone for nearly 4 decades is that you stop expecting surprises. You know which side of the bed they sleep on. You know they take their coffee with 2 sugars, not 1, even though they always say 1 when they're ordering at a restaurant because they're embarrassed. You know the exact way they clear their throat before they're about to lie. My husband, I'll call him by what I've called him for 38 years, in the good times and the bad. My husband had been clearing his throat a lot lately. Small things. A phone call taken in the garage. A weekend trip to visit his college roommate in Portland that felt slightly off in the details, the way a story feels off when someone's been rehearsing it. He came home with a gift for me from that trip, a scented candle from a shop in Portland, Maine. I looked up the shop. It didn't exist. I told myself I was paranoid. I told myself I was 63 and tired and that 38 years of marriage had earned me some baseline of trust. I found the hotel keycard on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I had a plan. His company holiday party was scheduled for the second Friday in December. Every year, same venue. The Harborview Function Room at the Whitmore Inn, 20 minutes up the coast. Every year, he went without me. It wasn't cruelty. It was just how things had always been. His firm was small. The partners liked to keep it internal. Spouses were never included. I'd never questioned it. 38 years, I'd never once questioned it. This year, I called the Whitmore Inn on a Wednesday morning and asked if they needed any extra event staff for the December 14th function. The woman who answered said they were actually short a server for that night. Someone had called out. I said I had experience, which is technically true. I'd waitressed all through college at a diner in Somerville. 40 years ago, but still. She said, "Can you come in for a quick orientation Thursday afternoon?" I said yes. I drove to the Whitmore Inn wearing sunglasses and my hair pulled back in a way I never wear it, tight at the nape of my neck, and I sat across from a young woman named, I think her name was something like Bree or maybe Brit, it doesn't matter, and she showed me how they carried the appetizer trays and where the service entrance was and what to do if a guest became difficult. I nodded, like I was taking mental notes. Mostly I was looking at the layout of the function room, memorizing which tables sat where, figuring out where a person could stand without being noticed. I told my husband I was going to my book club. He said, "Have fun. Tell everyone I said hi." He said that every time, even though he doesn't know a single person in my book club. I drove to the Whitmore Inn with my hair pinned back, wearing a white button-down shirt and black slacks I'd bought specifically for the occasion at a Marshall's 2 towns over. They gave me a small black apron at the door, a name tag that said June in capital letters, which almost made me laugh. They'd asked my name at orientation, and I'd said June without thinking, my actual name, and no one had blinked. The function room filled up around 7. I circled the room with a tray of crab cake appetizers and kept my head down and watched. I saw him come in at 7:15 with 2 colleagues I recognized from the firm's Christmas card, a tall man with silver hair and a younger one who always looked slightly nervous in photographs. My husband was wearing his good navy blazer, the one I'd had dry cleaned in November. He looked comfortable, happy even. The kind of happy that made my chest tighten because I'd been wondering lately if he still looked like that at home. For the first 40 minutes, everything was ordinary. I served appetizers. I refilled glasses. I kept to the edges of the room and watched my husband laugh at something the silver-haired man said and shake hands with people I'd never met, people who made up 38 years of his professional world that I'd only ever seen through the filter of dinner table stories. And then I saw her. She was standing near the bar, dark blazer, dark hair. She wasn't flashy, that was the thing. She wasn't the woman I'd been picturing in the worst versions of my imagination. She looked competent. She looked like someone who knew things. She was looking at my husband. I watched him notice her. I watched the shift, small, almost imperceptible, the way his posture changed and the way he became deliberate about not looking in her direction. The way he didn't look at her was exactly as telling as if he had. I set my tray down on a side table. My hands were steadier than I expected them to be. I crossed the room slowly, the way servers do, purposeful but invisible, and I ended up close enough to hear them when she approached him during the cocktail hour. She said, "It's almost time." He said, "I know. Did you confirm everything?" She said, "All of it. He's going to love it." He said, She's going to love it." She laughed. She said, "Right. Sorry." I didn't stay to hear the rest. I turned and walked toward the service door, through the kitchen, and out into the parking lot. I stood next to a dumpster in the December cold in my Marshall's blouse, and I tried to breathe. She's going to love it. I had been married for 38 years to a man who apparently had a secret, and the secret apparently involved a woman I'd never seen before, and whatever it was, she was going to love it. I drove home. I changed out of my blouse. I sat in the kitchen and didn't turn on any lights and waited. He came home at 10:45. He came into the kitchen and found me sitting there in the dark, and he startled. He actually jumped, which under any other circumstance would have made me laugh, and said, "Good Lord, June, you scared me half to death. How was book club?" I said, "Fine." He poured himself a glass of water and said they'd had a nice party. The firm was doing well. His colleague Frank had announced he was retiring in the spring. I said, "That's nice." He said, "You okay?" I said, "Just tired." He said, "Come to bed." I said, "In a minute." I sat in the kitchen for another hour after he went upstairs. I thought about the hotel keycard. I thought about the Portland candle shop that didn't exist. I thought about She's Going to Love It and what exactly it was. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday morning in late December, he told me he needed to run to the office. "A few hours," he said. "Something with a client file, year-end stuff." He kissed me and left. I watched his car back out of the driveway. Then I went upstairs to his study, which I am allowed to do. It's my house, too. I've vacuumed that room for 38 years. And I looked. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. More hotel keycards, maybe. Something concrete. Something I could hold in my hand and either explain away or not. What I found was in the bottom drawer, underneath a folder of quarterly statements, an envelope, my name written on it in his handwriting. Not Honey or any of the other pet names that had accumulated over the years, my actual name written carefully like it mattered. Inside was a folded piece of paper, and underneath the paper 2 airline tickets, Italy, Florence specifically, departing January 22nd. I read the paper. It said, "You've given me 38 years of your patience and your kindness and your willingness to pretend you weren't disappointed when I missed things I shouldn't have missed. I have been keeping this secret for 4 months, and it has been the hardest thing I've done since I asked your father for permission to marry you, because I am not good at keeping things from you, and you are very hard to surprise. Happy anniversary. Florence first, then, if you're willing. Rome. I have the whole thing planned. A woman at my office helped me with the details because I didn't know how to book anything properly. Her name is Cynthia. She's 29 years old and engaged, and she thinks you sound wonderful from everything I've told her. I tell everyone about you, in case you ever wondered." I sat on the floor of his study for a long time. The airline tickets were real. The hotel was real. I looked it up later, and it was exactly the kind of place I'd always wanted to stay in and never said out loud. A small inn near the Arno with window boxes full of whatever flowers grew there in January. He'd clearly done research, or had Cynthia do research, or both. 38 years, and he could still make me feel like an idiot in the best possible way. I thought about the hotel keycard in the planner. I went back later and looked at it again. It was from a Marriott in Millbrook. I thought about that gas receipt from 60 miles away. I thought about how many times he must have driven out there, back and forth, to set things in motion, and how bad he is at lying, and how I'd watched him clear his throat and assumed the worst about a man who had given me no reason. Not really, not ever, to assume the worst. He came home from the office around noon. I was in the kitchen. I had made soup. I do that when I don't know what else to do with myself. I make soup, something that takes time and smells like something. He came in and said, "Smells good." "What kind?" I said. "Split pea." He sat down at the kitchen table and picked up the newspaper, the actual paper newspaper he still gets delivered every morning, even though I've told him for a decade it's wasteful. I said, "I went to your holiday party." He put the newspaper down. I said, "I applied as an event server. I wore a name tag. You didn't recognize me." He stared at me. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then he said, "You were the one with the crab cakes?" I said, "Yes." He said, "June." I said, "I know." He put his face in his hands. I could tell from his shoulders that he was laughing, which is what he does when things are either very funny or very awful and he isn't sure which. Then he looked up and he wasn't laughing anymore and he said, "How much did you see?" I said, "Enough to think the worst." He said, "And now?" I said, "I found the envelope." He closed his eyes. He said, "I was gonna give that to you on Christmas morning, with coffee. I had a whole thing planned." I said, "I know. I'm sorry." He said, "No, you're not." I said, "No, I'm not." He stood up and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around me, which he hasn't done in the middle of the day on a random Sunday in longer than I want to admit. He smells the same way he's smelled for 38 years, which is something no one tells you when you're young, that one of the great gifts of a long marriage is that the person you love smells like home. I said into his shoulder, "You didn't recognize me." He said, "I thought you looked familiar." I said, 38 years. He said, "You were wearing your hair different." I pulled back and looked at him. He was doing the thing he does where he almost smiles but doesn't quite let himself. I said, "The candle shop in Portland doesn't exist." He said, "What?" I said, "I looked it up. There's no such shop." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Cynthia found it online. It might have closed." I said, "It's fine." He said, "You looked up the candle shop." I said, "I looked up several things." He sat back down at the table and looked at me with an expression I know well, one that sits somewhere between exasperation and admiration. And he said, "You know, most people would just ask." I said, "Most people aren't married to someone who takes phone calls in the garage." He said, "I take calls in the garage because the reception is better." I said, "That is the worst excuse I've ever heard." He said, "It's true." I said, "I believe you about almost nothing right now." He laughed, really laughed, the kind that goes all the way up. And then I was laughing too, which is also something no one prepares you for. That after everything, after all the fear and the quiet and the sitting in the dark kitchen, the thing that comes next is just the two of you at a table, laughing at yourselves. We went to Florence on January 22nd. The inn near the Arno had window boxes with small rosemary plants that had somehow survived the cold, and our room looked out over the water. And the first morning we had breakfast at a little cafe around the corner where no one knew us. And the coffee was better than anything I'd had in years, and my husband ordered for both of us in Italian that was frankly embarrassing, and I told him so, and he said he'd been practicing, and I said clearly not enough, and he said that was fair. We walked for miles every day. We went to the Uffizi and stood in front of things I'd only ever seen in books, and said nothing for long stretches, because sometimes nothing is exactly the right thing to say. We ate dinner late, the way people do there, 9 or 10 o'clock, at small tables where the menus were handwritten and the bread came automatically and the wine was ordinary, in the best sense of the word. One night, sitting at one of those tables, he asked me what I had thought, what I had really thought, when I saw Cynthia put her hand on his arm at the party. It was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "I thought my whole life had been a version of something instead of the thing itself." He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I'm sorry I'm not better at telling you how things are." I said, "I'm sorry I looked up the candle shop." He said, "I'm not sorry you found the envelope." I said, "You would have been on Christmas morning, Hoyes." He said, "I would have gotten over it. The stars weren't visible in Florence the way they are on the Cape. Too much light." But on the last night, we took a car out into the hills and sat on a stone wall in the cold, and I leaned against him, and we watched the sky do what skies do when you give them your full attention. 38 years, and there we were. Here is the thing I've come to understand about long marriages, the thing I didn't know at 25 or even at 45. They are not a single story. They are hundreds of stories stacked on top of each other, some of them beautiful and some of them hard and some of them just ordinary in the way that ordinary is its own kind of grace. And sometimes you find a hotel key card and you think the story is ending, and sometimes you're wrong. I was wrong. I am grateful every single day that I was wrong.